This is part two of the presentation on reflections on friendship and conversation. Now I'm going in a little deeper, and this next section is going to be talking about conversation, language, and emotions. Conversations are an intertwingling of languaging and emotioning. Maturana uses the term braiding, but I like intertwingling. It has a kind of a twinkling, reciprocal influence to it. I could also say that it's circular. An emotion changes languaging, languaging changes emotioning, and note they're gerunds. They're both meant to be a process. But you could also just say that it's systemic. They each influence each other, and where, anyway, in the circle are you if it's a circular, constant relationship? So I better to say they're co-present, intersected, intertwingled in a systemic manner. So, where do we begin? Consensual coordination. Here you see a flock of birds flying in or coordination with each other. They're sensing the world together, sensing each other together, and in this sensing, being coordinated. Because consensual does not mean consent. It doesn't take much to do this consensual coordination. We can do it too. In fact, we do it. Consider crossing a crowded intersection. You don't have to agree which side you're going to be on. You don't even have to signal. You don't need to discuss it. You just consensually coordinate and it flows easily. So it's part of our repertoire of action. But we have many instances where we have done this consensual coordination, and so have other animals. We're not the only ones to have this repetition of consensual coordination, repetition often enough that it becomes a recurrent thing that one can detect as a pattern. And if that happens, then you can do a further coordination on top of the pattern. You can do consensual coordination of consensual coordination. And when that happens often enough, then that pattern, the repetition of the coordination on top of the coordination can become a token. It represents the behavior. So, for example, a wolf pack, the wolf may get up, the head wolf, and that signals, oh, we're all getting up for a hunt now. The getting up in a particular way signals that you're doing this. A beckoning can become a meaning of come now, we're going to do something among humans. You can do a further consensual coordination on top of this token. In other words, the token itself has a presence, so you can think about it, refer to it, reflect on it, and refer to it, and give it a name. It becomes a named object. It is now a token, it is the gesture, it is the sound, it is a name of something that you can specify. So this is really very neat. And having distinguished and named it as a something, you have a lot of under development, which just takes a while. It takes a while for children to learn. It takes a lot of development underneath it to learn what the name means in context of many happenings of this coordination of coordinations. But having this named object is wonderful because now you can refer to it outside the original context. The getting up to go hunting wouldn't work if the wolf was in a different situation where hunting was not a possibility. It just wouldn't have a meaning. My beckoning to the back of the room, with you sitting here watching in the front as in a conference, wouldn't mean anything. You just kind of, huh? What's she doing? But with a name, we can now start talking about outer context, and what we have are stories. We can talk about it, discuss it, refer to what's been done, what might be done, what might exist, what might not exist. There you've got accounting, explaining, planning. Not all of it arises at once, of course. It arises stepwise. To eventually, here we are with that situation where we are living in conversations, a pattern of patterns in consensual coordination that can happen in any domain, whether it's concrete or abstract. Our human niche is growing and living in language. So you can look at the situation like these two ladies having baking session together. As we participate, we compose a unified whole of this doing in the flow of our experiences. It doesn't feel that you've done X, Y, Z. You've just been doing something together. But when you talk about it, we can talk, say, pars and trunk and name our behavior. There was stirring, chopping, melting, kneading, baking, and each of these has a meaning. And it has a meaning in context. If you look at these by themselves, bake, knead, stir, chop, melt, you wouldn't know what they meant unless you had some context to understand it. The names of the chunks do not specify their context. They don't include the between things, the things that happened between the chunks, the various things he had to do between kneading and chopping, for example, or melting and stirring. They don't indicate the entailments. What else is intended for this? For baking, you need to turn the oven on, and that may or may not be specified. But we do create procedures where we specify the bits that we might forget. So we have recipes. We've named actions that we've chunked from units in the flow, but the betweens are not there. They go missing unless they have been included through experience. So it is the experience of what the names of words mean that gives us their meaning. It is our own experience. Consider this little story. Two children were playing on the beach. The girl dragged the boy along the sand. Then he got up and ran away. And compare it now to this video of what actually happened. Oh, there's a lot of dragging going along. We didn't know he was just limp there. Is he okay? Well, I guess he's fine. They just got tired of it. And off they go. Back to the story. That's not what you felt when you heard that first, is it? What has happened so that the language misses the actions, the things that go between the words? There's a lot of stuff implicit in how we talk. The words themselves. I had an insight years and years ago when I was comparing that field of a number of related ideas. I looked at it in English, ended, used up, finished, completed, ripe a little off to the side. And then I looked at the same words in Estonian, my mother tongue. Otsas, lõppenud, valmis, lõpetatud ja küps. And then compare the two. They don't overlap the same way. The chunks have been designed to be different concepts in different grounded languages, especially when the languages come from different language families, different roots. So things go missing between one another. Another way we could look at this is to look at the field of colors. And we could name pink, blue, green, yellow, the stuff that goes in there, all the colors that go in there, we could call it the chunk. And what's between, well, maybe it's just not relevant. It's not enough to warrant a distinction. Maybe it's just ordinary and we don't want to refer to it. In a different culture, we might do this differently. We might name an orange and a pale blue and a dark blue, and there might be this paleness in the middle relevant somehow to something you're doing. What's more interesting to think about it, if you consider these to be different emotions that we had named, or different ways of thinking about this, person star could be thinking about, yellowness. And person white could say, yes, I know yellowness. And then everything is fine. They go along. And you don't even realize that actually person white's and person star's set of possibilities for what yellowness is were different. And this is fine when they overlap, because there's an adequate similarity. But what if person white was talking about this part of its yellowness, and person star didn't realize that? There would be a misunderstanding. But they could keep talking, and in that talking, you could have accumulation of situations and the conversation that expand that understanding. So, in effect, a growth of situationally relevant nuances and entailment that expands the awareness of what that yellowness could be for each in a variety of different contexts. In friendship, our chunks become richer. We have the pleasure of the growth of richness in our awareness. There's a serendipity in these encounters, as Mahaffey was saying. It's not something we plan and design. It happens naturally in friendship. Back to conversations as an intertwingling of emotioning and language. I want to talk about this emotioning aspect too. I was getting to it a bit with the colors. Emotioning is as a flow of different ways of relating. You could say domains of relational behavior. Different things we might do together in one set of emotions versus another. Let's go to something really primitive. And if some of you have seen my talks in the past, this and a number of other things are going to be quite familiar to you. A little unicelled animal, and a flagellate, for example, swims around in its environment, all is fine. And then something happens to a portion of the environment, comes around, and everything is fine until that's encountered. Oh, and then the behavior changes, and it changed in a way that it kind of chunked it out of the environment. If we look at this, we see for a while it's been what we would call tranquil, then distressed, and then tranquil again. We could name these emotions. Of course, the flagellate doesn't do that. It just behaves differently. It has two behaviors, and those two different behaviors have two different internal dynamics. To be distressed, there's a small shift, and it has to be a small shift. You can't just change everything. There's a little trigger that changes something that has further implications. If you wonder about why triggers make a difference to how you feel, that's why. Now, if there's something else interesting, if one of these little flagellates lives in an environment where it's almost always tranquil, it grows differently than one who lives in an environment that is not often tranquil. This is why we come to that well-known aphorism that the child raised in love is a different person than the child raised in anger. The developmental path of being in one or another matters. Here I'm going back to my notion of a living system in reciprocal relationship with a medium. Should be a circle, but here I've just shown the two arrows of structural coupling. One emotion, they may act in one way, another in a different way, and then come back, and then another emotion yet. And there's small internal changes to it correspond to each of this. There's like different fields of different ways of being. Like you can't kiss when you're angry, for example. But if you look at this over time, you would see a being for a while in this purplish emotion, then for another while in the orangey emotion, doing orangey things. Then suddenly there's blue, and that's a sudden shift to being very different in what they do. And this can go on over time from one flow of one emotion to another. Now, of course, I've drawn these here as strange, sudden changes. A lot of them aren't. A lot of them actually just meld one into another. But what's interesting, that due to structural intersection, in other words, there are parts of us entailed in all of these emotions, changes in one relational domain result in some changes to other relational domains. Look at the example for the trajectory for red and purple. Next time around, you come to purple. It's not just following that initial trajectory. It's shifted. It's become something different. It's been changed by what happened in between. There's the difference. Furthermore, because we're all connected as a whole, the changes in one domain due to the structural intersection remain coherent with the structure of other relational domains. It's all somehow connected. So what you do in one moment of caring can make a big difference to how you may be in another moment of being loving or being tranquil or sad. Every emotion has a chance of changing what happens and how it's expressed later in a way that's more or less coherent. So coming back to conversation and the idea of these chunks that I talked about with the example of baking, the meaning of a word, which is a chunk in language, can be seen as different in the different emotional domains. The meaning depends on what's adjacent possible, what else could happen next based on the emotion. So you could almost think of it that there's all these different possible emotions and all these different directions where the conversation could flow and branch depending on where you are. So let's say you're in pink. These are the ways you could be growing. And any one conversation will follow a particular path from that emotion. Similarly, the same word in yellow can lead to a different flow in the conversation, different sets of possibilities. And again for blue, here it goes in a different. What went happened there? There's a dissonance. It doesn't fit in that path that I thought it was going. Let's do a little rethinking. And you do this in the middle of a sentence sometimes. In the middle of a conversation, you realize, that didn't make sense. I misinterpreted. That person was not in blue. That person was in the yellow when he said that word. So you essentially reconstruct the conversation. So now it makes sense. And then you can follow that path. This is something I've just been thinking about lately. How along a simple conversation, a single sentence, you're constantly backcasting and reconfiguring what actually was meant. So this reminds me to always listen well and listen long enough to be able to formulate the proper understanding of what was meant. And then, of course, you have to have further conversations because we talk each other into alignment, as Helene Finidori mentioned during the conference. And this is going to be continued again. This was a surface middle section on language and emotions, so I have yet to talk about reflections on conversation, and in conversation, uh, reflecting in conversation on conversation. It can be very complicated, but also just a few moments of thinking about what it is like to be living in friendship. So to be continued.